I don't know why I thought camping alone would be a good idea. Maybe it was the stress of work, the constant noise of the city, or the way my apartment walls felt like they were closing in on me. I needed a break, a reset, something to clear my head. So, I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and drove out to a secluded spot deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. I had been to this area a couple of times before, always with friends, but this time I wanted to be alone. No distractions, no conversations. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind moving through the branches. I got there in the late afternoon, the sun still hanging above the treetops, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The place was beautiful, untouched. The only sign of human activity was the fire ring from previous campers. Setting up camp took about an hour. I pitched my tent close to the tree line, far enough from the fire ring so that sparks wouldn't be a problem, but close enough to feel safe. I gathered some firewood, enough to last me through the night, and made sure my food was sealed in a bear-proof container. There were black bears in the area, but they usually stayed away if you took the right precautions. By the time I got the fire going, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. I ate a simple meal, just some canned soup and a protein bar, before sitting back and letting the quiet settle in. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant chirping of crickets. Everything was perfect until I noticed something odd. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of insects and birds just a few minutes earlier, had gone silent. It was that kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like the world is holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an owl had flown in, maybe a predator was nearby, and the smaller animals had gone still. But it felt off, like something was watching me. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the warmth of the fire, but I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, looking for movement, listening for anything unusual. Nothing, just trees and darkness. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped up the flap. I lay there for a long time, listening. The silence didn't lift. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just an empty, waiting quiet. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to a sound outside my tent. It was faint, barely there, but distinct. The sound of something moving through the brush. Not the wind, not a raccoon. Something heavy, deliberate. My pulse quickened. I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on, the beam shaking slightly in my grip. The sound stopped. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Human footsteps. I didn't move. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here, miles from the nearest town, in the middle of the night? I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. My truck was parked a good distance away, and no other vehicles had been in the area when I got here. The footsteps circled my campsite, slow, unhurried. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't panicked. They were walking with purpose. I gripped my knife, heart pounding in my chest. I thought about calling out, but something in my gut told me to stay silent. I didn't want them to know I was awake. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, waiting for something, anything, but all I heard was that suffocating silence. Minutes passed, then an hour. I stayed awake, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, listening. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I didn't mean to fall asleep, but I must have because I woke up to the first light of dawn filtering through the trees. My body was stiff, my mind groggy, but the memory of last night came rushing back. I unzipped the tent slowly, knife still in hand, and stepped out. The fire pit was undisturbed, my food container untouched, but the ground around my tent was different. There were footprints, human footprints. They circled my tent, stopping just inches from where I had been sleeping. My stomach turned. Whoever it was had stood there, just outside the thin fabric of my tent, listening, watching. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking. Every second I stayed felt like a second too long. I threw everything into the truck, not caring about organization, just wanting to be gone. As I drove away, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. But there was no one, just the empty, quiet forest. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, parked outside a gas station, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I sat there for a long time, just breathing. I haven't gone camping alone since. Maybe I never will again. Because out there, in the middle of nowhere, miles away from anyone, I learned something I can't forget. The scariest thing in the woods isn't ghosts or monsters. It's other people. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A few days away from work, from screens, from noise. Just me, the woods, and the simple peace that came with being alone in nature. It wasn't my first solo camping trip, but it had been a while since I had taken one. Life had a way of pulling me away from the things that made me feel whole. This time, I was determined to enjoy every second. The spot I chose was deep in the forest, about 2 hours from the nearest town. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing near a small lake I had read about online, a place few people knew about, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, a small cooler with food, and just enough supplies to last me the weekend. The drive was long, the last stretch a dirt road that looked barely used. Trees closed in on both sides, making it feel like I was driving into another world. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The lake shimmered in the fading light, perfectly still. No signs of other people, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. I set up my tent near the water, close enough to hear the gentle lapping of waves if the wind picked up. It was a perfect spot, flat, quiet, untouched. After gathering some wood, I started a fire and cooked a quick meal. The smell of burning wood mixed with the crisp night air, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly relaxed. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire for hours, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Small animals moving in the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl. When the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, feeling safe in my little pocket of solitude. The next day was perfect. I spent the morning exploring, following a narrow deer trail that wound through the trees. The forest was dense but not suffocating, and there was a strange beauty in its silence. Occasionally, I would come across an old fallen tree or a patch of mushrooms growing in the damp earth. By midday, I made my way back to camp and spent the afternoon fishing. The lake was full of life, small fish darting just below the surface. I caught a few, enough for dinner, and cooked them over the fire as the sun began to set. It was the kind of day I had been craving, simple, quiet, perfect. That night, the feeling changed. It started subtly, a shift in the air, a kind of stillness that didn't feel natural. The forest sounds that had been my constant background noise seemed to fade, leaving only the crackling of the fire. I tried to ignore it, blaming my own mind for making something out of nothing. But the feeling stayed. Something was different. I ate quickly, watching the tree line more than my food. The fire felt too bright, making the darkness beyond it seem even deeper. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was alone out here, that nothing was watching me. But the feeling stayed. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the fire burning longer than usual, just for the comfort of the light. I told myself I was just being cautious, but deep down, I knew it was fear. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was a feeling, that deep, stomach-turning instinct that something was wrong. I lay still, barely breathing, listening to the silence outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull orange glow across the clearing. I strained my ears, trying to hear past the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then a sound, soft, deliberate, footsteps, not the quick, darting movements of an animal, but slow, careful steps. I held my breath, my mind racing. It had to be an animal. A deer, maybe, coyote, but the sound was wrong. Too heavy, too deliberate. Stopped just outside my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, feel the cold sweat forming on my skin. The canvas of the tent felt impossibly thin. I waited, barely daring to breathe. Then movement. The sound of something brushing against the fabric of the tent. Slow, almost testing. I reached for my knife, my hand shaking. My mind screamed at me to do something, to move, to make a sound, to scare it off, but fear held me frozen. The sound moved, circling the tent, slow and steady. I wanted to believe it was an animal. I wanted to tell myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew there was someone out there. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, gripping my knife, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps would stop, then start again, moving just outside the thin layer of fabric that separated me from whatever was out there. Then finally, silence. I didn't move, didn't dare check. I just lay there, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed, then hours. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I finally found the courage to move. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, knife still in hand. The clearing was empty. The fire was nothing but cold ash. But there, in the dirt around my tent, footprints. Not animal, human, circling the tent, pausing just at the entrance. I packed up in record time, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get out. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to think. I just grabbed my things and left, moving as fast as I could without breaking into a run. The drive back felt longer than before, the trees pressing in on me, the silence heavier than I ever remembered. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I finally let out a breath, my body trembling with leftover fear. I don't know who was out there that night, and I don't want to know. I haven't been back since. I never thought much about being truly afraid. Sure, I'd had close calls, near accidents on the highway, unsettling moments when I thought I was being followed in a parking garage. But those were fleeting, adrenaline spikes that faded as soon as the danger passed. Real fear, the kind that sits deep in your chest like a sickness, the kind that changes the way you see the world. I never knew that kind of fear until that weekend in the woods. It started out as just another camping trip. I'd always been an outdoorsy person, growing up with fishing trips, long hikes, and nights spent staring up at the stars. This time, I wanted to get away from everything. Work stress, the endless notifications on my phone, the noise of everyday life. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you can only find miles away from civilization. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, far from the usual campsites. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing I had found on an old map, nestled between a ridge and a slow-moving stream. I had my truck packed with all the supplies I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a knife, my hunting rifle, a water filter, and enough firewood to last me a couple of nights. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I'd be out in the woods for the weekend. I figured I'd have no cell service anyway, so there was no point in giving updates. The drive out took longer than I expected. The dirt roads were rough, barely maintained, and every mile farther from the highway made me more aware of how alone I was. The trees thickened, the underbrush growing wilder, untouched. By the time I reached the spot I had picked, the sun was already low, casting long shadows between the trunks. I set up my tent quickly, staking it down on a flat patch of earth near the stream. The air was crisp, cool enough that I knew the night would be cold but not unbearable. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back against a fallen log, listening to the sounds of the forest. Birds settling in for the night, the rustle of small animals moving through the leaves, the steady trickle of the stream. It was peaceful, exactly what I had been looking for. But as the darkness deepened, the peace started to feel different. It wasn't that the forest was too quiet. There were still noises, but they felt distant, as if the living things had pulled away from my camp. The air felt heavier, pressing down on me. I tried to shake it off as my imagination, the way the mind plays tricks when you're alone in an unfamiliar place. I stayed up late, staring into the fire, letting its warmth soak into me. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the fire burning low, just in case. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it, a sound just outside my tent. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the leaves. I held my breath, heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. I strained to listen, but everything was silent again. No wind, no animals, just the sound of my own breathing. I reached for my rifle, my fingers wrapping around the stock. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal, maybe a deer wandering too close. I tried to go back to sleep, but every little noise had me tensing up again. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. It all felt too close, too deliberate. When dawn finally broke, I crawled out of my tent, my muscles stiff from staying so tense all night. The fire had burned down to embers, sending up a thin trail of smoke. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching. I checked the ground around my camp, looking for tracks. There were a few disturbances in the leaves, but nothing distinct. Could have been anything. I should have left then, packed up and driven back to civilization. But I told myself I was overreacting, letting my imagination get the better of me. I was out here to enjoy nature, and I wasn't going to let a bad night ruin it. I spent the day hiking, following the stream deeper into the forest. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trees here were older, taller, their branches twisted in strange patterns. The air smelled different, damp and earthy, but with an undercurrent of something else, something rotten. I found an old structure, barely more than a foundation and a few collapsed walls. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The wood was dark with age, covered in moss. I felt a chill as I stepped closer. There were scratches on the remaining beams, deep, ragged marks, as if something had clawed at the wood. I turned back. I didn't want to be here anymore. By the time I got back to my campsite, the sun was already dipping below the trees. I built my fire higher that night, kept my rifle close. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise had my eyes snapping open. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I gripped my rifle, finger resting on the trigger. I didn't move, barely even breathed. Then the breathing stopped. Something pressed against the side of my tent. Not hard, just enough that I could see the fabric move. I fired. The shot rang through the trees, deafening in the stillness. I scrambled out of my tent, rifle raised. The fire flickered, casting wild shadows. Nothing. No blood, no tracks, no sign that anything had been there. But I knew. I knew I hadn't imagined it. I packed up, threw everything into my truck, not caring how disorganized it was. I left the fire burning, tires kicking up dirt as I sped away down the narrow road. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the highway, back in the world of cell service and streetlights. I never found out what was out there. I don't want to. I never liked camping. The whole idea of sleeping outside, exposed to the elements, away from the safety of four solid walls, never sat right with me. But my friends had talked me into it. They said it would be good for me, that I needed a break from work, from city life. Maybe they were right. Maybe I did need to get away. But I should have listened to my gut. We picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from any designated campsite. It was one of those places where you had to hike in, carry everything on your back. No roads, no other people, just dense woods stretching for miles in every direction. It sounded peaceful in theory, but something about it unsettled me even before we got there. The hike in was brutal. The sun was relentless, and the weight of my pack dug into my shoulders. Every step felt like a struggle. My friends, all more experienced hikers, moved with ease while I lagged behind, sweat dripping down my back. The trail was barely there, just a faint path through the trees, marked by the occasional orange ribbon tied to a branch. If we got lost out here, it would be a nightmare. After what felt like hours, we reached a clearing near a small river. It was the perfect spot, or so my friends said. Flat ground, plenty of space for tents, and easy access to water. We dropped our packs and set up camp. By the time we got everything sorted, the sun was dipping below the trees, casting long shadows over the forest floor. That first night was uneventful. The sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, should have been soothing, but they only put me on edge. I barely slept, waking up at every little noise, my heart pounding. It wasn't fear exactly, just a deep, unsettled feeling, like something wasn't right. But there was nothing there, just the trees, the wind, the darkness. The second day was worse. We spent the morning fishing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the trees, just at the edge of my vision. A shadow that didn't belong, a flicker of motion too fast to be an animal. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who ruins the trip with his paranoia. So I kept it to myself. We cooked the fish over the fire, told stories, laughed. But I couldn't relax. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the treeline. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, pressing down on me like a weight. That night, I barely slept again. Around midnight, I heard something moving outside my tent. It wasn't the usual forest sounds. This was slow, deliberate, footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe one of my friends had gotten up to pee. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon. But then it stopped, right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, deep, slow breaths, just inches from the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. I wanted to call out, to wake my friends, but my throat was dry, and I couldn't make a sound. I just lay there paralyzed, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, moving away this time, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The fire was nothing but embers, the sky a dull gray. Everything looked normal, but then I saw the footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot, leading from the trees, circling our tents, then disappearing back into the woods. My stomach turned. I woke my friends and showed them. They laughed it off, said it was probably just some crazy hermit living out in the woods. No big deal, no big deal. I wanted to leave, right then and there, but they convinced me to stay, said I was overreacting. And maybe I was. Maybe it really was just some harmless weirdo. So I stayed. I shouldn't have. That evening, we went deeper into the woods, looking for dry firewood. I stayed close to the group, not wanting to be alone out here. The trees were thick, the underbrush dense. It was easy to get turned around. That's when we found it. A small clearing just a few yards across. In the center, a makeshift shelter made of branches and leaves. And inside, a pile of bones. Animal, mostly. Deer, raccoon, maybe even a coyote. But there were others, smaller ones. Ones that looked disturbingly human. We stood there in silence, staring. The air felt heavy, wrong. We needed to leave. Now, we turned back the way we came, moving fast, branches whipping at our faces. But the trail wasn't right. It didn't lead back to camp. We were lost. My heart pounded as we pushed forward, trying to find anything familiar. The sun was going down, and with every passing minute, the woods grew darker, more hostile. Then we heard it. Footsteps, not ours. Something or someone was following us. Panic set in. We broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. None of us did. We kept going until, finally, we stumbled into our campsite. We didn't speak. We just grabbed our gear, packed up as fast as we could. The hike out was a blur. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps behind us, to see something in the trees. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest. We made it back to the car just as the last light of day disappeared. No one said a word as we threw our gear in the trunk, climbed in, and drove away. The tension was thick, unspoken. We all felt it. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know, but I'll never go camping again. I always loved camping. There was something about being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the sounds of the forest, the smell of the earth, and the crackling of a fire that made me feel at ease. But this trip changed everything for me. It was supposed to be a solo trip, something I had done many times before. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had everything I needed. My tent, sleeping bag, food, water, knife, and my old reliable flashlight. I chose a remote spot deep in the woods, a place I had never been to before but had read about online. It was about a 3-hour drive from my home, followed by a 2-hour hike to get to the camping area. That was exactly what I wanted, complete isolation. The drive was uneventful. The last stretch of road was a winding dirt path through dense trees, leading to a small clearing where I parked my truck. The trailhead was just ahead. I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders, locked the truck, and set off into the woods. The hike was peaceful at first. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional squirrel scurried across the trail. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. After about an hour and a half, I noticed something odd. There were no animal sounds, no birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just my own footsteps and breathing. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a quiet part of the forest. I reached my campsite just as the sun was beginning to set. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by towering trees. I set up my tent quickly, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going before nightfall. As I ate my meal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt off. The silence was heavy, unnatural. By the time I climbed into my tent, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and turned off my flashlight. The darkness was complete. I lay there listening, but there was nothing to hear. No wind, no insects, just dead silence. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up suddenly. My heart was pounding, but I didn't know why. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. Something was moving outside my tent. It wasn't the scurrying of a small animal. These were slow, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for my flashlight and knife, gripping them tightly. I stayed completely still, hoping that whoever or whatever it was would just go away. The footsteps stopped. Then, something pressed against the fabric of my tent, right by my head. I held my breath, waiting, listening, and then nothing. The presence was gone. The footsteps didn't retreat. They just stopped. I stayed awake for hours, knife in hand, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I dozed off, though my sleep was restless. Morning came, and as soon as the sun was up, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. There were no footprints in the dirt around my tent. No signs that anything had been there. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had been half dreaming. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to stay one more night. I had come all this way, and I didn't want to turn back just because I had scared myself. The second day went by without incident. I spent it exploring the creek, gathering firewood, and trying to relax. By the time night fell, I was feeling more at ease. I made a bigger fire this time, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. But that night, things got worse. I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, I knew what had woken me. A sound. A low, steady breathing. It was coming from just outside my tent. I stayed completely still, listening. The breathing was deep, slow, controlled. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone was outside my tent, standing there, breathing. I reached for my knife again, gripping it so hard my knuckles ached. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then suddenly it stopped. Silence. I waited, barely daring to breathe myself. Minutes passed. Then, the worst part, the zipper of my tent moved. Just a little. Not enough to open it, but enough that I heard it. Enough that I knew someone was trying to get inside. That was it. I wasn't waiting to see what happened next. I flicked on my flashlight and shouted as loud as I could, trying to make myself sound big, angry, dangerous. The second my light hit the tent walls, the presence outside bolted. I heard footsteps crashing through the brush, moving fast, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun started to rise, I packed my gear in record time. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just threw everything into my bag and started hiking back to my truck. The whole way back, I felt watched. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but I could feel it. Eyes on me, following me. I reached my truck, practically threw my bag into the back, and sped down that dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that place. Never tried to find out what had been out there. I don't know if it was just some messed up person living in the woods or something worse. But I do know one thing, whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it was watching me. I never thought much about fear. I've had my fair share of uncomfortable moments. Being lost in a strange city at night, waking up to strange noises in my own house, the occasional feeling of being watched. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened during that camping trip in the mountains. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Just me, a tent, a few days of solitude in the wilderness. I had done this plenty of times before. Packing up my gear, heading deep into the forest, setting up camp far from any trails or people. The solitude, the stillness, the isolation, it was all part of why I loved it. The drive took most of the morning, winding through roads that got narrower the further I went. Eventually, I turned onto an old logging road, barely more than a trail carved through the trees. It was rough, with deep ruts and loose gravel, but my truck handled it well enough. After about 40 minutes of careful driving, I found a clearing large enough to set up camp. It was perfect. Tall pines surrounded the area, blocking most of the wind, and a small creek ran nearby, providing fresh water. I parked the truck, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent. The usual routine. Firewood was easy to gather, and by the time the sun started dipping below the trees, I had a good blaze going. I cooked a simple meal, beans and sausage, nothing fancy. The first night was uneventful. The air was cool but not cold, and the forest was alive with its usual sounds: crickets, the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned low, casting faint, flickering shadows against the walls of my tent. I lay still, listening. The usual night sounds were there: the wind, the insects, the occasional creak of tree branches shifting in the breeze. But something else was off. Then I realized the forest had gone completely silent.
No crickets.
No rustling leaves. Nothing. Just an oppressive, heavy stillness. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get when an animal is nearby. This was something else. Like the entire forest was holding its breath. I sat up, heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shined the beam outside. The trees stood still, their branches barely swaying. The fire, down to glowing embers now, cast just enough light to illuminate the clearing. Then I heard it. Not a footstep, not a snapping twig. Something worse. Breathing. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Steady, measured breaths. Not the panting of an animal, not the ragged gasps of something struggling. Human, deliberate, just beyond the tree-line. I held my breath, straining my ears. The breathing continued for a few seconds, then stopped. Silence. Then, a faint shuffle, like something shifting its weight. I stayed frozen, flashlight aimed toward the trees, but the beam revealed nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly, carefully, backed into my tent and zipped it shut. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the feeling had passed. The forest came alive again, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I had been half asleep, dreaming. Maybe it had been an animal. Still, I packed up and moved my camp a couple of miles deeper into the forest, just in case. The second night was worse. I had set up in a similar clearing, this one a little smaller, more enclosed by trees. I built another fire, cooked another meal, forced myself to relax. As the sun went down, I kept telling myself it had just been my imagination the night before. Nothing to worry about. I went to bed early, exhausted from the lack of sleep. I must have dozed off quickly because the next thing I knew, I was awake again. This time I knew exactly why. The breathing was back, closer. I lay completely still, barely daring to breathe myself. The sound was unmistakable. Slow, steady breaths, just outside my tent. My mind raced. I had my knife, my flashlight, but what good would they do? I couldn't see anything. I couldn't run. Not in the dark, not through the trees. Then slowly I heard something new. A zipper. My tent's zipper. I bolted upright and grabbed my knife. The zipper didn't move again. I shined my flashlight toward the door, but the fabric blocked most of the light. I waited. Nothing happened. No movement, no sound. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, waiting. Eventually, dawn came. I forced myself to step outside. The first thing I noticed was the footprints. Not animal tracks, bare human footprints circling my tent. I didn't pack up. I didn't eat. I grabbed my gear, shoved it into my truck, and got out of there. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. Who would believe me? Just footprints, just breathing. No real proof of anything. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I haven't been camping alone since. I had always liked the idea of camping alone. There was something about being out in the middle of nowhere, away from people, away from noise, just me and the wilderness. Felt right. Felt like the way things were supposed to be. So when I found a remote spot deep in the forest, miles from any marked trail, I thought it was perfect. I parked my truck at the end of a barely visible dirt road, grabbed my pack, and hiked in about 5 miles. The further I went, the more peaceful it felt. The sounds of birds, rustling leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot were all I could hear. I found a small clearing surrounded by tall trees, soft moss covering the ground. It was perfect. I set up my tent, started a fire, and cooked a simple meal. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky orange and pink. As darkness settled in, the air grew colder, but the fire kept me warm. I sat there for hours just listening. I heard the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote. Normal sounds, nothing out of the ordinary. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, the forest was silent. I left the fire burning low, just enough to cast a glow outside the tent. I fell asleep fast. I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a noise that woke me. At least I didn't think so. It was a feeling, a deep, gut-level unease. I held my breath, listening. The fire was nearly out, just glowing embers. The forest was too quiet. No wind.
No insects.
No night sounds. Just silence. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps on the forest floor. They weren't far from my tent. Not rushing, not hesitant. Just steady, slow steps. My first thought was an animal. But animals don't move like that. Not with purpose. Not like a person. My heart pounded. I reached for the knife I kept in my pack, gripping the handle tight. The footsteps stopped. I lay there, listening so hard it hurt. Nothing. Just silence again. I wasn't about to open the tent and look. That was how people in horror movies got killed. I stayed still, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Maybe more. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, or maybe just some small animal passing through. I tried to sleep again, but it was light, restless. Morning came, and with it, relief. The sun was bright, the air crisp. Everything felt normal again. I checked around my campsite, but there were no signs of anything unusual. Just my footprints and some deer tracks near the tree line. I felt stupid for how scared I'd been. I spent the day hiking, exploring the area. By the time I got back to camp, I was tired, but in a good way. I cooked dinner, built up the fire again, and let myself relax. That night, I woke up again. Same feeling, same dead silence in the forest. My skin prickled. Then the footsteps started again. Closer this time. They stopped just outside my tent. I gripped my knife so hard my hand hurt. My breathing was shallow, controlled. I listened, waiting. Then something pressed against the side of my tent. Just lightly, like a hand. I exploded out of my sleeping bag, holding my knife out in front of me. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice shaking. Silence. I waited, heart hammering. Then, slowly, the pressure lifted. The footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I didn't move. I stayed like that until the first light of dawn started filtering through the fabric of my tent. I packed up immediately, threw everything into my bag, doused the fire, and started hiking back to my truck. The whole way back, I felt watched. The forest still felt too quiet. I moved fast, not stopping to rest. When I finally reached my truck, I tossed my pack in, jumped inside, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, just breathing. Then I saw them. Footprints, not mine, leading from the trees straight to where my truck was parked. I never went back to that spot, and I never camp alone anymore.